my girl and I go out and join the park parade.
Hello and welcome to another episode in Battlefront's podcast called Collecting War. It's been a great run so far. We've had some very interesting interviews with collectors and military enthusiasts, researchers, restorers, and so on. Today we have another collector in our podcast, Fabrizio Farrugia. He's no stranger to Battlefront, of course, because he's in the committee, and I've known him for many years. So although I have known Fabrizio for a long time, this will be probably the hardest podcast to do because obviously I know some of the answers he's going to say, so I have to be really careful about my own bias and so on. But we'll push through. So first of all, Fabrizio, as I said, is a Battlefront member. He's here with us. Can you please say hello?
Hello. Again, I'm Fabrizio Farrugia. I'm really glad to finally be doing this podcast because I think I have some more stuff to offer than other collectors. And I think we can carry on.
So, to introduce Fabrizio, he's a reenactor, of course. He collects various things. So my first question, as I always say to people on this podcast, is: are you a collector? Do you consider yourself a collector? And if so, what do you collect?
I think that I am a collector. Yes, I mean, collecting has now taken a big part of my life. To what I collect, I think it's a matter of almost everything that I could find at a good deal. However, the one thing that has been really a center of my focus has been bomb disposal equipment, which I think, and it's the point is that I actually managed to find it, so it was just a chance collecting.
So this is something we've been discussing before the podcast, that as with the interview with Giancarlo and even younger collectors, for us, I mean, it's really is important to find things at the right time and the right price. You can't just say, I want that, and then you just go and buy it. Maybe in the past you could, but now you can't.
Exactly. I mean, being a student, well, and still doing some work on the side, you don't have that big of a budget to work with when it comes to the world of collecting. If you go to any average website, you just notice that most things are way beyond my wallet, at least to start with. So the one thing I can collect is a good deal, more or less. So being able to find a piece of history militaria at a good deal, what do I mean by this? You might find someone who won't know what it is, so you get a better price for it. So it's a matter of chance that we find the stuff that we actually collect.
A lot of collectors bring up the argument. They say you don't need money to start a good collection. All you need to do is research as much as possible so you can get the better deals. What is your comment on that?
Fine, I do agree in part, a small part of that you don't need money to start a collection, but I want to elaborate on this because you would still need some money to get something which people know what it is. If I want something which I know what it is, fine, there is the research backing it, but and especially if it's something not in the country at present, to purchase it, you would still need a larger budget than you would need if there was something which people don't know about. Fine. So I agree to the fact that you can start a collection cheaply. So, but the stuff that you would probably want, most people would know what it is. So.
Of course, and even, I mean, things as time goes by, like even what we used to think is cheap is now, even if you find something now, I mean, something a trauma me and Fabrizio both share is that we collect things made out of brass, and whenever we go to the local market, we find bullets and casings and they're made of brass. So now, recently, maybe Fabrizio can correct me, recently, if it's brass, equals expensive immediately, and it wasn't before.
And ironically, because of the current turmoil, both of the country and the European Union as a whole, prices in scrap metals have gone up, which automatically means that anything made out of brass, which as going back to what we said earlier, that people won't know what it is, they still see it as a value of brass, and naturally now everything has gone up by 50%, more or less, and people won't go down on prices because since it's shiny and it's made out of a semi-precious metal, that means it's worth much more than what it is.
Yes.
So
And it's of course sometimes you still find something made out of brass that is expensive, but for us it's cheap because we can perceive it for what it's really worth. For example, you find a shell from a cannon that or an artillery piece that is very rare. So for us, we think it's valuable at a certain
but it does
price.
have a set limit on
Of
its
course.
value. I think that's where we, or at least I, in difference to other collectors, is when I go up to if there's a market, if there's a website, whatever, and I see a shell, which I know that I could get for €60, let's say, and it's €200 for no reason, then there's no way that I will actually buy it. It's just a matter of why would you pay more for something which, again, these shells aren't effectively rare. There millions of shell cartridges have been fired, so finding some which are rarer than others, fine, fair enough. But I still believe that people shouldn't overpay for what military is actually worth.
Okay, so let's dig deeper now. So far we've discussed collecting in the sense of the actual logistics of it. So where you go, we mentioned markets, we mentioned online, and we mentioned how to haggle for prices and how that's becoming now. So now let's dig deeper. So someone might say, okay, but why would I even want to spend 1 cent on something from military? Why is it interesting?
Well, as a matter of interest, I think the history attached with it, obviously, of especially local history. So Malta during the Second World War has a lot, which I think it doesn't really add too much value on certain items. So we would get shell casings and whatever, they would just keep the same price everywhere. But when you get personal stuff, so for example, German prisoner of war made items, those would hype up the prices quite. They're quite extremist when it comes to their price range. On the other hand, yes, you can still find war relics lying around everywhere, especially in Malta. One thing which is often found is barbed wire stakes, for example. It's something that you could still find lying about in fields, on walls, on cliff edges, here and there, and even pieces of shrapnel, for example. But these are items called rust. Which people more or less shy away from actually collecting, even though they're a huge part of militaria, for example. So since they take up more maintenance and more expense actually to keep them, most of my items are worthless, and to the fact that they are so worthless that I actually have to put a lot more money into them to maintain them, rather than for what they're actually worth if you were to sell them to any other collector in the military market, for example. So it's just a matter of, I appreciate the item because I know the work that if, let's say, one simple barbed wire stake, it would still have had to travel probably either from the UK to Malta in a convoy, had to survive several air raids, submarine attacks, whatever, until it actually made it here to be used. So there's the story and the whole road of it actually being used in Malta, which I think adds the value.
Here I have to play devil's advocate because I have been in many fields and random places with Fabrizio trying to excavate things made out of rust that are even thrown away. But now I have to obviously I agree with Fabrizio, but now I have to sort of say, okay, but why? So when you look at an object, when you look at a barbed wire stake, does it intrigue you because of the story behind it?
It intrigues me more of what it means. And what do I mean by this? First of all, it's an item which actually managed to survive 80 years of weathering and basically being at the mercy of any Maltese farmer to being scrapped at any point in time in those 8 years. So it managed to survive that far. I want to keep it to survive a bit more. The story that it holds is just as if you had, I do believe that it's as worth as if you had an actual plane from the Second World War. It's still a part, even though it's a smaller part of the Second World War, that, again, still holds the story connected to the country itself.
So for you, the Second World War is sort of dispersed in these objects. These are the relics of the Second World War.
Yes, and even building on this, we, as a community, whatever, of reenactors, can use these items, and it's something which we have done in the past. So we could still make use of them. We could still show that these were a big part of Maltese history, or just history in general. So they're not dead items. That's why I don't like it if there's a barbed wire stake just rotting away along the coast somewhere, because again, we could still show that it played a big part in building up the defenses of the island.
Some people might say, even within collecting circles, like, what's the point of collecting these things? Sort of, why wouldn't you rather focus your time and energy on something more worthwhile, sort of, than just going collecting barbed wire stakes, barbed wire, and pieces of shrapnel?
The thing is that what I'm doing now is I'm still young, so I get the opportunity that my time is still. I still have some available time to actually care for these items, and the thing still young and still have some energy to do these things. So I almost see them as a sort of an investment, because in the future I really do believe that I will find these items readily preserved at the very least, so they would still be in my collection per se. And if I have to give them out to the next generation, then they'll be there, and hopefully would have added on quite the number of years. I also want to add on to this that the thing is now that since I have collected so many, for example, we'll stay on the topic of barbed wire stakes, that I now have enough that if I wanted to, for example, I could set up an entire display of how barbed wire would be stacked around the island. So that's I guess a part of it, because if you have just one, it's good as a showpiece to sort of show what these looked like and how they were constructed, whatever. But the actual amount now that I do have, I could make something, a quite visual display of what the defenses actually consisted of. So.
And some of them might have actually been used as defenses, so you literally...
No, they were.
One of the things that as reenactors to us, it's obvious, is that we like to proverbially keep history alive. So whenever we find a barbed wire stake, we say, maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, but for me, and I think we share the same perspective, say that object has been through a war, and if we can bring people to see it through actually putting it back in how it was used, we're like giving it back a second life. For us, it's obvious that it's worth doing, but for people, they say, why? Sort of specifically because it's associated to war. So, for you mentioned that, of course, Second World War is an important part of Maltese history, etc., and we see fit to use these objects to tell the story again. In terms of specifically barbed wire, it's something very gruesome as well. People get stuck to it. The first thing that comes to mind, I don't know what comes to your mind, but in World War I, people literally body stuck to barbed wire. So someone might say, apart from the argument that it's rusty and it's pointless and it's too much of it for now, why even bother bringing up something that possibly people died on or could have died on?
Well, I think that I find the point in that sentence itself, that people could have possibly died on it. So with it is attached the story of the actual human that might have been caught on it. Now, it might be an insignificant part of a soldier's life of having been caught on barbed wire. It could have caught onto an animal, it could have caught onto anything. But again, I would still make the argument that it has some sort of value. I wouldn't know how to quantify it, whether if it's historical value per se, value of individual value. I really don't know, but it does have some sort of value. It's just a matter of, the work, even the design of the item, how it was made. I really do think that these are testimonies to the past. So you would have, again, a simple piece of angle iron with some notches on it, and then barbed wire gets attached to it. What's the significance there? But it still shows the development of, for example, from the First World War, which had certain barbed wire stakes, such as the pigtail barbed wire stakes, and then in the Second World War, where they made slightly, if you want to call it that, simpler barbed wire stakes, which were made out of angle iron. So you could see also the development of time within these items.
So far we've talked about two sort of sources of value for you in these items. So first of all, you said it's because of the story. They hold a lot of history. And secondly, it's we're laughing because there's a Fabrizio's dog. I think he's looking for barbed wire stakes as well in the background. I think he heard me as well. So that's the first value, history. And the second value is that obviously the amount of thought that went into these, the energy and thought and even genius that went into making these things, mass producing them, transporting them to Malta. So that's two values. So now, so you also collect artillery shells and explosives, not explosives, but things that were meant to deal with explosives or their explosive warheads, etc., etc. Put simply, things that are designed to explode and kill people. Do you think that you collect them because of this fascination that they are dangerous?
Yes, definitely. In my personal life, some of my other hobbies include lighting fireworks and, quite a lot of other explosive stuff, let's say the least. I have a keen fascination with it. But I think also what's attached with it is, for example, the bomb disposal stuff is seeing the equipment, feeling it in your hands, even just the weight of it. You would get an idea of what these people had to go through. Could you imagine being stuck with a 500 kilo bomb right next to you, and you have a box which, in theory, that stuff should stop it from exploding? So I think you can't really put yourself in that situation, but just imagining it, the amount of algorithms that your brain has to go through to try and feel the same phenomena is, I think, quite a difficult thing to even imagine. Just feeling the items, they have an aura of this is the emotional capacity that these people had. It's quite a lot to process.
So for you, it's like connecting with the emotions that these people using them felt.
Yes, and these people did them like they were doing an average job. If they were a secretary in an office, as if they were a secretary in an office. So again, it's not that I could understand how you would zone yourself into doing that work, because again, it's not comparing, but lighting fireworks, it's not easy. It's literally having almost artillery shells going up above your head, 30 meters above your head. So that's and sometimes coming down if something goes wrong. So it's not something that just anyone can do. And if you're scared to do these things, it will be much worse. If you're scared, you're probably gonna get hurt. That's quite a belief that I have, and again, it begs the question. It
takes the confidence.
Exactly. No, but it begs the question also how confident bomb disposal units were here in Malta, for example, for being literally the most bombed piece of rock on the planet.
So you were with me when we interviewed Simon Cousins. You were next to me and you heard it. So one thing Cousins said that you're reminding me of right now is that part of why he collects is the admiration for the generation. You remember? He said, I admire the wartime generation. Do you share that thought?
Of course. I really do think that they... I really do think that they had a lot of guts. So that's the first thing I would say. And even though I do understand that it was a different time and we could argue all day about how could they have let another war happen just 20 years after the First World War, which, was one of the deadliest wars in history up to that point, and then literally 20 years later repeating with an even bigger destruction of the whole human race. So having these items, I think it really shows the connection between. I really do think that these items are useful to connect people. Actually, nowadays with life of 80 years ago, it's hard to put into words to start with. The items that I collect, again, each one has a story behind it. So you would start to compare, if that's even approvable. How an individual would have treated that sort of item back then, and if I were to give it to someone who has no idea what it is nowadays, what would he do with it, or she? I think it's again seeing that with all the technology that we have today, a war nowadays is fought by drones unmanned, dropping grenades on others. So World War II was quite different. There was a lot of technological advances, but even it took a lot of courage and a lot of guts to fight it, and then it took even more courage and religion to go through it.
Then sometimes I even pick up something up and I say, how the hell did they actually use? So not sort of, even if you know how they use it, like how did they manage with just this? Right now I'm thinking about, for example, artillery instruments with all the mats and the But there's a lot of things that you even wonder how you're saying, like, how the hell did they go through it with this equipment?
Even the engineering of the items
Yes,
it's quite
of
fascinating
course.
because they had to work with tools of the time to make certain objects, and even those certain objects were either very simple but difficult to use, or very complicated and complicated to use. So it wasn't the push of a button, material that we have today to a point.
Would you consider collecting things from more recent wars?
Well, on the matter, I have some items which are of more recent conflicts. For example, I have uniforms from Korean War, whatever, even some Vietnamese items, for example. But I don't think it's not my niche. So I just like collecting stuff from the Second World War, since Malta was at the center of it to a point. So I think it has a lot to do with actually being proud of the country to start with. So I am really attached to Malta's history of what a piece of rock sticking out of the sea managed to go through all throughout its history. So I think there's a lot attached with that. And World War II is the second great siege of Malta, effectively.
So has it always been this way? So right now, so what I'm asking you is, so this perspective, has it always been this way since you were young, or is this something that's developed through the years?
Well, ever since I was young, I was always interested in conflict. Let's just
Conflict. What do you mean by conflict?
conflict, wars, struggles. That's the best way to explain it. I've been always. I don't consider that I had a normal childhood. My childhood was pretty much based on watching watching National Geographic, the Discovery Channel. So I was exposed to watching documentaries. It was a matter of, I remember some of the documentaries when I was young were Apocalypse, they were greatest tank battles. Again, a huge copyright at the end. They molded my mind to, it's not that I was rooting for one side when I saw these documentaries when I was young. I think throughout the years it then shifted to...
Which side?
Well, as a matter of fact, it depended on which documentary. But for example, it was mostly the Russians in some of the tank battles. Sometimes it was the Germans. Sometimes it was even the Americans. But they were all in their own context. So if there was, for example, a documentary about the Africa campaign, I was rooting for the Germans. If it was about Operation Barbarossa, I was rooting for the Russians. It was strange because then when I grew up, I started to understand, the amount of death and destruction that that war had associated with it. If you're young, war is something fun. The older you get, you still consider it as something fun, but you get to notice what's wrong with it. Mm-hmm. That's something I really believe in.
And something I talked with Giancarlo, and maybe you agree with, is that reenactment allows you to sort of enjoy, or even collecting, enjoy war completely from far away, or enjoy the good parts of it.
Of course. And some people, I would almost argue that like the bad parts of it as well.
Which bad parts and why?
I think, a lot of killing. So, it's still a matter of fact that people collect, for example, material associated with the Holocaust. In my opinion, I don't think those things should be collected. At least not by private individuals. I think they should be just collected by the organization who takes care of, for example, Auschwitz. It's an organization where they collect items which had to do with the Holocaust. Keeping things private, no, I mean collecting things just because they were associated with the Holocaust. I don't really agree with it on the whole, because I think that should be a whole area of collecting, encompassed in itself. I think it should be displayed by people who actually know what it means, rather than people who only collect it for collecting.
So for you, if someone collects something from the Holocaust, he's also almost taking possession of the memory, which should be public.
Exactly.
So for you, a private collector sort of captures certain memories, and there's a limit or a certain range of what is acceptable for a private collector to own.
Mm-hmm. No, a limit, Well, when it comes to these things, it's again, there's a lot of debate on these things. If you were to tell me if I had a personal diary of, for example, a fighter pilot and there's a lot of interesting stuff in it, my argument would be that I can keep it as part of my collection, but I would make it public. What do I mean by this? We have technology nowadays to scan these items, to put them up for the public. They could be copies could be given to archives, whatever, and these things could be readily accessed. I see a big issue in having an item, some collectors having items, and then they just keep them to themselves, because I think that really hurts the memory of the actual item. Because if I know what something is, why shouldn't everyone else know? At least in the collecting world, to start with. If I know what it is and then I die, who else will know what it is? My children might come along who have no idea about collecting and just throw these things away. So at least if there are a lot of personal items, I would suggest that they would be digitized to start with, or at least a copy be made available at any point of the item's life. So
you just stepped on another topic, which is how we communicate collections and collecting to younger generations. So you mentioned when you were young, you used to watch Apocalypse and all these documentaries, and these were made by people who were older than us at the time.
Yes, exactly.
Some of them probably collectors or spoke with collectors, and they created something educational for the younger generation. So do you think it's how much are collectors responsible for keeping the memory of Second World War and having control of how it's said?
I think, well, first of all, I think it's really important that the information is constantly sort of pumped out, because that's something which I compare to a lot from when I was young to nowadays. There's you don't see a lot, you don't see almost any historical information about the Second World War running around on modern platforms. So I think that's one big issue. If you were to go on TV and watch National Geographic, you would still more or less, even though they're really unideal, the documentaries, because I think they are really inaccurate on a lot of matters, but you would still find some. But people aren't watching TV and watching National Geographic nowadays, or at least not young people. So I think that's one big issue, getting away from that. How are we going to transfer to the modern age, sort of imprinting history on the younger generation's mind? So at least it's at the back of the mind of everyone. Of course, you find a lot of stuff on YouTube, which fine. It's the start of actually transferring this information into the modern age, but it's becoming ever more difficult to actually keep up this education, because at some point you can't keep transforming World War II into something palpable today. I think it will be difficult, especially 20, 30 years from now, because for now there are still collectors, there are still people enjoying the subject more or less, there are still enough people doing research, whatever. But again, for the future, I can't really tell because I'm still young. So for the future, I would try to find a different way of actually including World War II, for example, as a school subject, as in part of curriculums. I think as early on, and that's a huge little point. I think in the early stages of school, it's not taught enough. What do I mean by this? I'm not going to go teach children about the Holocaust when they're 5 years old, but there's the age of between 11 and 16, for example, which where there is a gap of World War II history, especially here in Malta. History in Malta is more focused on the time of the Knights.
And why do you think?
Well, I think it's older, so it's much more. There's a lot more known about it to start with, and it's much more visible. You could still see fortresses, walls everywhere littered around Malta, watchtowers. So I think it's something which you get to see clearly.
You're forced to see.
You're forced to see, but again, they had a significant impact on Maltese history. So I think it is of importance that we do teach this stuff. But I also think that, if you were to tell me what did you learn in your history lesson where you were Form 1, Form 2, I would say about World War II. I would say that I got to learn that it happened between 1939 and 1945, and that there was this really bad man called Hitler. That's about it. So that was the schooling I got about World War II, where, again, a lot of other stuff was focused on. So, for example, the Hypogeum, the temples. But there isn't enough precedence or importance on the World War II subject here in Malta.
And why do you think is it so important to teach about World War II? What is so important? Why is World War II so relevant to teach nowadays?
I think it's one of the most recent recent histories of the Maltese Islands. You could still see signs of World War II a lot around the island, and people seem to be having this issue of trying to forget World War II, which is you don't really see it. It just happens naturally, I guess, where the subject sort of dies out because it's not an issue anymore. We're not at war. We're not dying. We're not hungry. So again, but the argument would be that you have to show that our ancestors, our grandpa, our Busnanit, had gone through the war, and somehow they managed to survive that. So it's a testimony to them rather to what we do nowadays. It's because of them that we sort of managed to survive. Because if they had surrendered, who would have known what would have happened? So it
was a crucial point.
Exactly. I really do believe that Malta was a turning point in World War II. If Malta hadn't absorbed so much attention by the Axis, even causing damage as it did to Italian convoys, whatever, going to Africa. I really do believe that the war in the desert would have had maybe a different outcome, and World War II would have either been dragged on for many more years, or possibly the Axis could have won enough where they could have a safety barrier and would have made the Mediterranean an Italian lake effectively. So that's it, I guess.
There are some people, and I will ask you this question, and this is specifically mentioned in one of my favorite memoirs by Manchester, who was a Marine. He fought in Okinawa and in the Pacific Theater, and he said that people are afraid to admit it, that the Second World War will never match the poetic depth and the the scale and the emotions involved in the First World War. So people will, and we see it, I think we can see it, that people, even when they choose where to go, there's a lot of, we can talk about this as well, when people choose where to spend their holidays, for military geeks, they like to go to the Ypres and the Somme, because many people die there. And there's a bigger tragedy, a lot more death. So it's much more people, even when you look at books and even when you type regiments history on Google, they always focus on World War I. So he says that the Second World War is ignored because it will never match the sacrifice and the depth of the first. What is your comment on that?
Well, I really do like the subject of World War I. Actually, if you have to tell me what books do you read, they mostly concern World War I.
And do you collect World War I as well?
Yes, some stuff. But again, it was an 8 or 9 front war, but people focus on one front. So it's the French front, the Western front. So there's a lot of, even when you try to understand that war, again, like I just said, there was a million different fronts. In the Aegean, in Gallipoli, there was in the Sinai. So again, coming up from Baghdad, plenty of areas where there were conflicts in that war, but people focus on one area because it's closer to home to the victors, let's say that. So it would be to France and Britain, the Somme, Ypres, like you said. It's much more, it's closer. People could actually see the damage that was done by the war. It was literally a scar running through France and Belgium. So again, the locals could give a testimony there and there of what actually happened in that war. And again, victors often write the history. So
So for you, people, because this is the same point you made with the Knights of Malta, people choose to remember a war that which they encounter physically every day. So for the Knights, it's the bastions. You walk into Valletta, you're surrounded with the Great Siege. There's Valletta itself.
And I would also say that since the siege was very popular among Europe, there was enough consensus that even if the locals did not want to remember it, people would remind them of it because it was a tall tale of how Christianity won against the Ottomans. So.
And it's the same for World War One. You're saying, right?
Exactly. It was the reconquest of Alsace-Lorraine. So the French managed to get their land back, which I think again hammered them in as the victors. Germany was in tatters economically. Food was non-existent. But anyway, again, I'm not an expert on the subject, and it's just my perspective of how I see the difference between the First and the Second World War.
So for you, the Second World War is sort of sidelined because it's sort of a miserable repetition of the First.
Yes. It is. I think it simply is a larger, more miserable realization of the First World War. The First World War was there, and it was meant to be the war to end all wars. That's the famous the war to kill off wars, but it only, in fact, managed
the Great War.
Exactly, it only managed to make things worse. To make things worse. Again, it's a difficult one to think about, but the difference, why would the Second World War not be remembered as much? I think because people were sad of saying, London got bombed, for example. Why would you want to show that, you didn't have enough of the Air Force to protect you from being bombed? So I think it was a matter of shame. In fact, for example, the sinking of the battleship, I forgot its name, at Scapa Flow, and the very few...
HMS Oak or something?
Royal Oak?
Royal Oak.
Again, I can't remember exactly. But these things were almost hidden because, you have the Royal Navy, which is the best navy in the world. And suddenly it got attacked at its home base, and it's a breach of pride. I think that also has a lot to do with it. In fact, what I see is that it's not what I say. The difference between the First and the Second World War is that, at least in the First, the victors weren't complete victors. So what do I mean by this? Even though parts of Germany were taken over by French custody, whatever. Not one side. There wasn't a side which broke the other side to the depth of the Second World War, for example. So I think the Second World War was just a complete victory. I think the end stages of the Second World War managed to peter out very fast. So people immediately just thought, okay, finally we got rid of this. Now no more.
There was a conclusion, you're saying.
Exactly.
Whereas the First, it was sort of a stalemate, no? Sort of.
It was a stalemate.
So to a certain end.
And what happened? The big war between the biggest warring countries ended, but the amount of wars that continued, it was never ending. The Polish-Russian War, the Polish-Soviet War, the Russian Civil War, there was a Russian-Finnish War, which liberated Finland eventually. The Balkans was still fighting the remnants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Germany had the Spartacist movement, and a million other revolutionary groups. So it honestly never ended. And you could still see that because all throughout the rise of Hitler, it was still just carnage of people slaughtering each other, assassinations. I don't think it ever really ended.
So to put the discussion back into collecting, is this all going through your mind when you see an object? And when you're thinking about this, like, how much of history does the object of this history we just discussed, does it need to contain for you to obtain it, or to see it fit into your collection?
Anything can fit into my collection.
Within the laws of physics.
Within the laws of physics. I'll reason this out. Well, a battleship might not fit. The reason is that, we're going back to casings here, but even smaller stuff like a canteen, water canteens, food trays, whatever. These things I now have at least 10 of each. So you would argue why you only need one for a collection. And people who collect cartridges and whatever would say because there are different head stamps, there are different dates, whatever. For me, that doesn't really matter. As you know, I mostly collect stuff. Even stuff that I do have in my collection, I don't know what they are, for example. And it's thanks to you that I get to know what they are. But again, to the point that I was coming in, if I see a bow, worst case, even though I have 15 of it, if I get a good price on it, I'm still going to buy it. So there is that addiction/hoarding to the element of collecting at a point, which I don't think many other collectors get now. I think it's just there's collectors like myself who, if they see something at a good deal, even though they already have enough of it, you would still get it, because if you have the space for it, then sort of the reasoning is why not.
Why not? Because
And you know what these things mean. So even you know their value, not for their monetary value, but again, like I said earlier, they have been through 8 years, having survived 8 years after the war, of not being, for example, scrapped or thrown away. I think in my collection they find refuge, sort of, from being destroyed. That's my argument of why I keep collecting the same stuff over and over. And
like
over
an
again.
urban rescue ranch.
Exactly. It's a rescue. It's the collector's rescue.
Yes, I see it that way as well, because you collect things that many people wouldn't even people who would enjoy a discussion like we just had about World War II and history, but they think that something is so insignificant. I'm thinking about shrapnel or mortar casings.
Or an average shell
or
round,
a shell round. Yeah, yes.
whatever.
So I think if there is a bad side of collecting, which is hoarding, which is the excess of collecting, if we can put it that way, there is also the other end where people only like to buy very pristine examples.
Exactly. And one thing I want to touch upon is also that, again, I had the space to keep collecting a number of this stuff. Now it's getting more difficult because space is really running out. So I've even had to sell some stuff, which I have in multitudes of, to make space for stuff which I don't. So there is that element of now I'm running out of space and I'm getting more selective in what I purchase and get, for example. But if something is free, it's probably coming home anyway.
So on this point, this is something most collectors perhaps don't really encounter, but you buy and sometimes you sell. So what are some of the dilemmas involved in selling objects from your collection?
I never want to sell stuff from my collection. It's not a matter of you get attached, but in my mind, they have more value than what they're actually worth. So
sometimes they quantify it.
Exactly.
To us, maybe some people it is.
When I come to sell some of the stuff, it has to be. I'm not gonna say to the right person, because if somebody's gonna offer you money and you're in a tight spot where you need, even if you want to buy something better and it's gonna be sold at any time, so you would sell these things and you would have them turn up back again in a market, which were things that happen, as you know. So it is quite a shame if you give something to someone and then you find it somewhere else again. So you personally, it's difficult to just sell an item from my collection. I would rather give it away, because if I give it away to the right person, then I know at least that way it's gonna be kept, preserved, and at least well maintained to survive another couple of years.
It's almost as if when you sell something, it's like the object changes, because now it's like it's something that is
monetary.
So it's like, but if you gift it to someone, it's a different kind of object, because maybe you can.
It has the meaning of friendship, sort of. I trust you with an item, which again has you are able to conceptualize what I conceptualize about the item. It has that same value to you.
You see it the same way I do.
Exactly. So you would be able to see the history behind it, and again.
So when you see people selling, I mean, we've been to a lot of shops together and markets and God knows where. Or even websites. So when you see things, we go on a website and you see, militaria priced very sort of systematically. How does that make you feel?
Well, the irony is that people get to use these websites as baselines for setting a price. But really, how can you price something from the Second World War?
They might say, depending on the demand, for it. And the supply.
Again, and fine, fair enough. But even we've noticed this here. You would go to buy a helmet and a Mark II Broaden, and they would ask you €200 for it here in Malta. Whereas if you go to the UK, £20, £40, you'll get a decent example, for example. supply and demand, yes. I would also argue, and this is something which I argue a lot when I'm purchasing something, that, if there's a shell, whatever, there were literally millions upon millions made of these, so one way or another I'll get one, even if it's not from that merchant that I want to get it from, because there wouldn't be an agreement on the price. Again, like I said, there are some websites which keep a realistic value on the items, which I respect a lot, and it's more or less where I buy most of my stuff from. So I really think if the person selling it knows its value, then even himself, he'll make a better profit, because he will actually sell the item. So
Yes. And obviously there's another side to this, that people buy and sell, and some people, you mentioned this problem before, the space and the space to care for these items. Sometimes people buy things.
People think that these items are a really worthwhile investment, and that's something that we have seen. We've had people nowadays who buy stuff just to say that, when I'm 20 years down the line, I will sell them for a profit. That's the reasoning. But people don't really understand that to maintain a price, you have to do maintenance on the items, oils,
which
leather,
will cost
care,
you.
Which will cost you, exactly. And even storage and time. That's a larger cost than what the maintenance items actually require. If you have the storage, fair enough, why not? But time is really something that these items really require. You can't just go around and say, okay, I'm just going to leave it a year without giving some oil to it, even if it's in a perfect condition. Some maintenance would need to be done. So you are using time up for those items. I don't think it's a loss.
No, it's not a loss.
But I think it's an equal, pro and con.
Would you define collecting as a hobby?
Yes, why not? I really do think that people can have this as a hobby. Most collectors think highly of themselves and consider themselves as professionals. It's something which has happened to me in the past. I've had other collectors coming here who had, it's not about having the ego, but who had their self-prestige sort of as their, huge collectors. They really know what they're doing, okay. And then they come here. They first gasp, because then they see that, the item I'm trying to sell them, I have another 10 of it, and they think that they're buying an item which there's only one of. So that's one thing. I think people don't understand how much production there actually was in a lot of items from the Second World War. And
because we fetishize them, no, we think this is
exactly.
Something rare.
And something else is that, again, like I said, collectors come to my collection and they tell me what the items are, and I really find that fascinating, because they think I do this. They think that I'm a professional once they see the amount of items that I have. I really am not. If you want to, rather than a collector, I would say I prefer restoring the items, because it gives me something which I can physically touch and do to maintain the items. I find more enjoyment in actually restoring items and conserving them, exactly, rather than actually collecting them per se.
So on this point, are you one of those people that prefers to have an item in good condition and making it in good condition, or you like to leave it as it is?
Well, depends on the item, fair enough. But if I know that I can't take care of something, so for example, let's say a barbed wire steak, I can't just keep oiling it. So what would that entice me to do? I would need to eventually remove every bit of rust, paint it with an undercoat and then an overlayer, just to preserve it for a longer amount of time. Because again, these things aren't worth the time to keep maintaining them. But you can do some stuff. I'm not just gonna say you go over a Luger and you go and paint over it to preserve it.
With red oxide.
With red oxide. I'm saying...
I will ask this to Stephen Petroni.
What I'm saying is that there are several items, mostly made out of metals, that, could be much better maintained. But going back onto your original question, for example, casings. I don't polish casings, which people often do. It is something, they would have been polished, they would have been clean to have been fired and used. Obviously, it would cause wear on the gun if they weren't. I even have items from shipwrecks. So, why would you remove corals and stuff like that, which has accumulated over the years? Again, like I said, it depends on the items. Restoring some of the stuff to maintain it, that I would argue it's a good thing to do. But having stuff which is in original condition, which the story of its patina, a good excuse for rust, has attached. I think that it still encompasses a bigger story. If you had to remove it, it would reduce not its value, its historical value rather than
its value to you. Let's say, put it that way. So, with all this that we discussed in mind, obviously we're part of the younger generations, and someday we'll be a part of the older generation. Hopefully, unless we blow up or something similar. So let's talk about the younger generation of collectors that will succeed us. If you have a son or a daughter, and he wants to take up his father's illness, what would you say to him?
That would be excellent. I love free labor. It would be again. I do this a lot with a lot of people. People come here to learn how to restore certain stuff, for example, and I do that free of charge. Well, and people are gonna say, well, use them as slave labor to work on your stuff and to clean up your stuff. Yes, but but the difference is that if I had to do something, it would take me 1 hour. If I get another person and I'm teaching him, it would take 6 to 7 hours easily of teaching a person how to restore the simplest of items. But I think with that, there's a big advantage because you're teaching people skills, which if they don't, they are not present 10 years from now, there won't be anyone to restore these items. Because again, I don't only show people, how to do it, but I try to give them the context of why the item is valuable and why it should be restored, for example.
So people they learn how to conserve things and take care of them, but also learn how to have that perspective that you share with them of how to actually appreciate these things.
Exactly, and I also want to show them that these things can be fun. You could learn from it, and there's a lot of people are lacking a lot of practical skills nowadays. So, and this is a simple way of getting someone to know how to do something. It's people getting to restoration. It isn't a perfect art. You often get to know how you best restore something by breaking it, because having you would have to learn woodworking, welding, polishing brass, whatever. Or there's a lot of skills involved with maintaining the simplest of items, painting, sanding. There's a lot of small skills which can help you even in life grow. That you can develop certain skills which will help you out later on.
So to start wrapping up, so where do you see your collection after Fabrizio?
Probably in a scrap heap somewhere.
That's what Giancarlo said.
I really do think that. If I don't start seeing the next generation of collectors within the next 30 years. It's quite. I don't know where it's gonna go. I would like to argue that I want to give it to a museum or to something so that they can preserve it, but I have no faith. I would rather have another private collector carry on the torch of collecting per se with the items attached. What you would say? Why don't you have any trust in museums, whatever? Yes, but again, it goes against the whole concept of collecting. If you're just giving something out to, let's say, a museum, an archive, whatever, I think then that the items are gonna be stored, whatever, better, but there's no connection for them to go with people just now. The community of people. So having stuff at my house in my collection, everyone who comes here gets to see the collection. And even though they might not have an interest in the Second World War, they might not have any idea what the items are, they come and they actually see the items. They actually know that these things existed, and that they played a part in our history.
A lot of these items as well, you just mentioned people that have no idea what they are, they still find them fascinating. One, because the materials, you don't find them nowadays. A whole fucking 2 kilos of brass, you don't see that nowadays. Or something that even the touch, the way they smell, the way the sounds they make, they are very weird things when you think about it. I'm thinking about shells, I'm thinking about
Even
telephones, uniforms.
You have webbing made out of leather. It still has a smell to it. There's, there's almost a taste in the air of going into the room where the items are housed. There's quite a lot. It might be mold, but
So for you it's important that these items to be remembered properly. So we discussed why it's important to remember them, but for you to remember them properly, you have to involve the senses.
Of course.
Touch them,
you
use them.
Feeling the weight of an empty shell casing, and then noticing, wait, this would have been filled up with another 10 kilos of powder and another 15 kilo warhead. It's and you would then have to assume that a soldier would have to load this into a gun, at least 20 of these in an hour, let's say. So there's a lot of considerations into the actual physical meaning behind these items.
So we spoke about admiration for the people who use these items. We spoke about the need to appreciate these things more. So my last question, of course, I always ask it to everyone, is who would you recommend to interview next?
I would like to interview you next.
Will do me. I think this was a very interesting.
I think that's never going to happen.
Yes. I've been thinking about it, but I think I will think about it and we'll organize a day. But I think this was a very interesting podcast because it's always interesting to speak about people from my age or younger collectors, because so far I will talk to people from, and they have a very set and concrete idea of what collecting is and why, or if they have a critique, it's also very set still.
As a second option, there would be Ethan Borch if he has.
Yes, as well. That's a good idea. So it's always interesting. I think this was great. I hope people listening to this enjoyed it as well. And we'll see you at the next one.
See you. Thank you.
When my girl and I go out and join the park parade, arm in arm we stroll.